Homeland Security Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from an expert panel that will outline how the government-sponsored censorship laundering enterprise operates, the price the American people are paying for the Department of Homeland Security's role in the censorship laundering enterprise, and the legal and constitutional implications of the department's role in censoring American voices. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability's hearing titled Censorship Laundering: How the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Enables the Silencing of Dissent. Today's hearing will examine the Department of Homeland Security's role as the nerve center of the government scheme to censor the online voices of millions of Americans, laundering its efforts through a veil of ostensibly independent, non-governmental organizations. Freedom of speech and open debate are essential features of a free society. Efforts to censor public discourse under the guise of countering misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation threaten this fundamental right. To clarify, no one would argue or is arguing that hacking voting machines or posting incorrect voting locations to prevent people from voting would ever be acceptable. This committee recognizes that CISA has a monumental task and supports CISA's critical mission to secure our federal networks and critical infrastructure. But as our witnesses today will attest, CISA has deviated from this core mission and risks losing the trust of Congress, the American people, and its vital private sector partners. What was initially a limited effort to counter foreign disinformation on elections metastasized into a sprawling effort that directly or indirectly censors Americans' discourse and debate that are the hallmark of our democracy. In 2018, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, was charged with protecting election infrastructure, which CISA decided unilaterally included countering election misinformation from foreign malign actors. By the 2020 elections, mission creep found CISA pivoting away from foreign sources to focus on domestic, quote, misinformation. But the government knew this would raise huge constitutional concerns, so it helped create non-governmental entities, such as the Election Integrity Project, to do for the government what the government could not do on its own. And they knew it. Listen to the head of the EIP.
This is not because CISA didn't care about disinformation, but at the time, they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these four different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves.
So government supported and funded NGOs to try to fill the gap of the things the government could not do themselves. That is just incredible. In a matter of a few months, CISA helped set up this censorship infrastructure. CISA acted as a switchboard, to use their words, to flag what they called misinformation and notify social media platforms who could independently, they say, decide whether to remove or modify the content. All told, according to one source, during the 2020 election, this scheme resulted in 859 million tweets collected for misinformation analysis, 22 million tweets and retweets categorized as misinformation subject to censorship, 21 Twitter users, Americans, domestic sources, identified and stigmatized as, quote, the most prominent repeat spreaders of disinformation, all of whom, perhaps coincidentally, were on the political right. And it's not just for elections. The same network, using the same tools, censored dozens of purportedly false COVID-19 narratives, many of which have subsequently been acknowledged as being true. So where is this headed? What is stopping DHS from overreaching its jurisdiction again to censor more Americans on whatever it deems critical infrastructure? In fact, who can say that it's not being done right now? We know DHS wants to expand this activity. Just last year, they tried and then retreated under ridicule from creating a disinformation governance board. DHS documents suggest that CISA wants to target issues as wide-ranging as racial justice, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, and financial markets. The current CISA director has given us a clue as to what the ultimate goal might be. Listen to her.
If you think about it, our mission is critical infrastructure. The most important critical infrastructure there is our cognitive infrastructure. And so building that resilience is, part of the mission set, in my view.
George Orwell called, and he wants his dystopian future back. I'm gravely concerned with CISA's efforts in this space. How on earth was this censorship laundering enterprise allowed to metastasize? Where are the civil liberties protectors within DHS, and what are they doing? It is obvious that there has been an abject failure of leadership within DHS to allow this expanded role of this nature to occur. This scheme of censorship by proxy represents an attempt by the government to accomplish indirectly and in secret what it would not have the power to do openly. It should give all Americans who care about civil liberties, who care about freedom of speech and association, great pause. I look forward to the testimony today. I thank you all for joining us. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome all the witnesses. Good afternoon. I'd like to take a moment to express my condolences for the families of the 8 people who were killed and at least 10 who were injured when an SUV deliberately slammed into a crowd at a city bus stop near a shelter for migrants in Brownsville, Texas. I would also like to acknowledge the tragic act of targeted violence in an outlet mall that left 8 people dead, including 3 children and 7 injured in Allen, Texas. Texas is one of 2 states in the U.S. that has seen 17 mass shootings so far this year. I want to say, with respect to this hearing, I had initially thought that the focus of the hearing would be on, because it is the Homeland Security Committee, dealing with false information, misinformation, disinformation that is aimed at, frequently by foreign parties, but not solely. We have domestic issues as well. Disinformation and false information is aimed at undermining the United States and creating additional problems for the United States to be used against us. Some of that is domestic, certainly with respect to President Trump and the election denial issues. I thought that might be the kind of thing we would talk about since it represented a fundamental threat to democracy. And it's still ongoing. I guess as we saw on CNN last night, he's still saying that he won the election. But from the information standpoint, the lead up to the election was the president at the time and many of his representatives in the White House and colleagues in the Republican Party saying basically that if he lost the election, it would be because it was stolen. And then we know that based on the investigation that's been going on in Georgia and other places, that he called the Georgia Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger, and pressured him to find, quote unquote, find 11,780 votes so he could claim victory. And we have other variations of that too. We've got even people here in Congress who can't bring themselves to admit that President Trump didn't win the election, even though they're courts in those states that have already declared that there was no fraud or theft of the election in those states. And we have ongoing variations of that. For example, in Arizona, I guess Ms. Lake is still saying that the election was stolen from her, even though there's clear, according to the officials in the state, that that was not the case. Also, I thought that we might take a look at other issues of misinformation and disinformation. For example, this committee has heard frequent testimony about the issues of the Sinaloa cartel, using misinformation, disinformation, false information with respect to the United States and with respect to migrants who might want to come to the United States, to trick them into thinking that they can come here and find work easily or whatever in order to bring them to the country. And then frequently my colleagues suggested they use them as then mules to bring drugs into the country, and then also might use them, and we're aware of this as well, to trap them in work or sexual prostitution and other activities. But they're using misinformation and disinformation to encourage them to come. And one of the things that DHS has been, I think, trying to figure out how to do correctly and more extensively is to get the message out to those people in those countries that they shouldn't come to the United States. In other words, to fight against the disinformation that the cartel's pushing. We have examples in the United States, and we can go through the active shooter, mass killing scenarios at some point if we want, but many of these are lone wolf individuals who have been hopefully tricked, but maybe that's just the way they viewed it, into believing that they should follow principles of Nazism or white supremacy or other lines like that. That leads them to become active shooters. Usually they act alone, they're lone wolves, but I think frequently we've seen in the aftermath of these killings, the statements they make online and about their beliefs, and many of them, especially those who've been drawn into terrorism, the information that they've got that persuaded them to become involved in terrorism in the United States, and that we need to try and find ways to address that in the United States so we can quell that effort to turn people against us in our own country. And then we have, with respect to the January 6th rioters, we've got ongoing misinformation and false information about these people being peaceful protesters or tourists even though I think it's clear, I think they've got 650 people plus have been convicted of breaking the law on that day, some as serious as seditious conspiracy. We've got domestic groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, who actually they just were convicted a few days ago and were spewing this kind of misinformation as well. Clearly it creates a domestic threat to us that I thought we could take a look at from the standpoint of misinformation and disinformation. Then there was Russia, and with respect to their thinking about it, as they were preparing to invade Ukraine, they tried to do false flag information and information that was misleading, I think in an effort primarily to try and shatter the NATO coalition. And we took steps. I thought the Biden administration handled that well, especially by doing preemptive releases of information that we'd gathered, the reconnaissance that we'd gathered through our foreign assets and assistance, and also our domestic agencies, in order to show that what the Russians were putting out was false information. And that was critically important because it helped to preserve the NATO coalition in the war against Ukraine. I thought that those were the kinds of things we were going to talk about, and I guess Ms. Miller-Idris, I guess you are going to talk some about that. With respect to the censorship issue, which is fine, we can address it, I suppose, although I'll note that even though it's an important issue, it's not really primarily within our jurisdiction, which is why the Judiciary Committee already had a hearing on this, I think dealing with some of the same issues. I guess we'll get into the Twitter files and the like in a few minutes. And I believe Section 230 was referenced in the test, maybe your testimony, Mr. Turley, with respect to the points that you want to make. And that's fine, but the censorship issue, which we can talk about, is kind of tangential to the primary mission of this committee, in my view, which is protecting the homeland. And I think that's why, in large part, those issues have been separated out from our jurisdiction here in the Congress and given to the Judiciary Committee and to some extent Energy and Commerce, which also had a hearing on this too. But we can talk about those issues, but for the witnesses, to the extent you're up for it, one of the things I will be asking you is, how do we try and deal with the sort of issues that I just mentioned? I think, Mr. Turley, you referenced in your testimony, I want to say it was on page 11, that you recognize that there are problems that can come from disinformation. The focus of your testimony and your paper is on censorship, but I do want to hear, though, with respect to dealing with these issues, how do we address those? And some of those could be the same topics that we just raised. I think Ms. Miller-Idris will say, and I share this view, that censorship isn't the way to address those national security issues and domestic security issues. We need to try and find a way to address the misinformation and false information, frequently by using counter pushes on information and the like, which I thought was what the board was set up to do. And we'll talk about Nina Jankowicz at some length later in the hearing today too. But I hope we can talk about those issues as well. Mr. Turley, I don't know if you testified in the Judiciary Committee previously on this issue. You did. Okay. So I appreciate your views on that, and gentlemen, I know you have strong views about what happened to you personally with respect to that issue. But I do hope that we'll find a way to talk about the homeland security angles of these issues and what we need to do to protect ourselves and our citizens from false information that is being used against us as a nation and is creating domestic and foreign relations problems for us. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. I ask the witnesses please to stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. And I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Ben Weingarten is an investigative journalist and columnist. Dr. Martin Kulldorff is an epidemiologist and biostatistician and a professor of medicine on leave at Harvard University. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris is a professor at the School of Public Affairs and School of Education at American University. Mr. Jonathan Turley is the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at George Washington University. I thank the witnesses for being here today. The chair will now recognize each witness for oral statements. Each oral statement will be limited to 5 minutes, but submitted written statements by witnesses will appear in the hearing record in their entirety. I now recognize Mr. Weingarten for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Government's first charge is to defend the life and limb of the governed. DHS and CISA have vital roles to play in this regard. Because their mission is so critical, we are compelled to scrutinize them in good faith. I offer today's testimony in this spirit. Our republic rests on the inalienable right to free speech. That right is under assault by those working to toss their political foes into the digital gulag in defense of our democracy. Disturbingly, the federal government itself appears to be a key culprit. Overwhelming evidence suggests federal agencies, top White House officials, and lawmakers colluding with big tech and often government-coordinated and funded counter-disinformation groups have imposed a mass public-private censorship regime on the American people. This regime has suppressed opinions that diverge from its orthodoxy and even facts inconvenient to its agenda on an ever-growing number of topics, starting with elections, moving to COVID-19, and now covering many other contested issues, all under the guise of national security and public health. CISA is core to these efforts. CISA has served as a censorship conductor, driving regular meetings between security agencies and social media companies aimed at encouraging the platforms to combat purported mis- and disinformation. That is, to censor disfavored speech as the government so deems it and by the government that regulates them, and they have. CISA has served as a censorship switchboard, in its words, collecting purported misinformation from government and non-government actors in the form of tweets, YouTube videos, and even private Facebook messages, and relaying the flagged content to the platforms to squelch it. And CISA has served as an architect of the broader public-private censorship regime, helping originate, consult, network, and partner with often government-linked third parties to themselves serve as First Amendment circumventing mass surveillance and mass censorship enterprises. These systematic speech stifling efforts, often targeting core political speech and intensifying during elections, seem tantamount to a conspiracy to violate the First Amendment and running domestic election interference. In short, we've unwittingly been paying unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats to silence ourselves. We're told these speech police are pursuing thought crimes for our own good. Authorities say MDM, mis, dis, and malinformation, fuels violent extremism and therefore that it must be purged. They ask us to ignore the selective and cynical linking of speech they disapprove of to terror, and they allied their mandate to suppress truth, malinformation being based on fact by CISA's own definition, but the intent or impact of which our betters disapprove of. Never discussed are questions like, who determines what constitutes MDM? Should it be the state, which itself has cast as MDM that which it later acknowledged was settled science, or we the people? If the state justifies speech regulation on national security or public health grounds, what are the standards for determining when wrongthink is sufficiently dangerous to rise to the level of censorship? If skepticism about mail-in balloting, which Jimmy Carter and the New York Times once shared, or skepticism about COVID policies that, if more widely heard, might have saved lives and liberties, amount to violent extremist threats to critical infrastructure, as DHS has indicated, making such speech ripe for suppression, what about anti-cop sentiment, or pro-abortion sentiment, or radical environmentalist sentiment? And if wrongthink must be verboten, why stop at censoring it on social media? Why not pull every TV network that propagates wrongthink off the air? Or review every text in every library and bookstore for wrongthink and burn the offending titles? Why not censor wrongthinkers' chats and emails? Why not ban them from the internet and suspend their mail service altogether? And while we're at it, why not make it illegal for wrongthinkers to possess pens and pads too? Would proponents of the censorship regime trust their worst political foes with these powers? We may believe our fellow Americans hold bad ideas, if not ideas that are plain wrong. But the worst idea of all is that government should be the arbiter of what we're allowed to speak and hear. We're a free people capable of judging ideas on their merits, citizens, not subjects. Eviscerating the First Amendment will neither make us more democratic nor more safe. It would be the stuff of tyranny. Congress has a responsibility to stand athwart history, yelling stop. With another election season looming, censorship tool is likely becoming more powerful and the censorship regime's ambitions only growing while it stonewalls and scrubs evidence of its past doings. This subcommittee's oversight efforts are most urgent. This body should endeavor to fully expose DHS's role in censorship past and present, and directly and by proxy, curtail funding, implement legislative remedies, and hold accountable all those who engaged in unconstitutional acts in connection therewith. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Weingarten. I now recognize Dr. Kuldorf for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you all for having me here. Censorship can be deadly. Freedom of speech is always important, but is especially important during a national emergency such as the pandemic. No authority is infallible, and when a new virus emerges, it is impossible for politicians and public health officials to get everything right without listening to discussions between a wide cast of scientists with different ideas and expertise and thoughts. I'm an epidemiologist, a biostatistician, and a professor of medicine at Harvard on leave. For over 2 decades, I've done research on the detection and monitoring of infectious disease outbreaks and on the safety evaluation of vaccines and drugs. I helped build the nation's disease surveillance systems, Despite this, I was censored and blacklisted during the pandemic by Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. In early 2020, we already knew from Wuhan data that there's more than 1,000-fold difference in COVID mortality between the old and the young. During the pandemic, we failed to adequately protect older Americans, while school closures and other lockdown measures generated enormous collateral public health damage that we now must live with and die with for years to come. During the spring of 2020, Sweden was the only major Western country to keep schools and daycare open for children ages 1 to 15. Among those 1.8 million children, there was 0 COVID deaths, and the COVID risk for teachers were less than the average of other professions. This showed that it was safe to keep schools open. It was important for America to know that, but the July 2020 New England Journal of Medicine article of school closures did not even mention Sweden. That's like reporting on a new medical treatment without including information from the comparison control group. Unable to publish my thoughts about the pandemic in US English language media, in the summer of 2020, I used my Twitter account to share the Swedish data and argue for open schools. But in July 2020, Twitter put me on their trends blacklist to limit the reach of my open school posts. In October 2020, I authored the Great Barrington Declaration with 2 fellow epidemiologists. We argued for better protection of high-risk older people while keeping schools open and letting young people live more normal lives. This was shadow banned by Google and censored by Reddit. Our Facebook page was unpublished. In March 2021, Twitter censored a post when I wrote that, quote, thinking that everybody must be vaccinated is as scientifically flawed as thinking that nobody should. COVID vaccines are important for older high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with prior natural infection do not need it, nor children. Twitter falsely claimed that the tweet was misleading and it could not be replied to, shared, or liked. We have known about infection-acquired immunity since the Athenian plague in 430 BC, and the questioning, denial, and censoring of such natural immunity is the most stunning denial on scientific fact during the pandemic, with deadly consequences. At a time when vaccines were in short supply, we were vaccinating young adults and people with natural immunity who did not need it, before many older Americans whose lives could have been saved by it. Another example, through randomized studies and reviews, we know that face masks provide only marginal or no protection against COVID. It is then dangerous to make older, high-risk Americans believe that masks will protect them when they will not, as they maybe go to crowded restaurants or supermarkets thinking that the mask is keeping them safe. In May 2021, I was temporarily suspended by Twitter for 3 weeks for writing that, quote, naively fooled to think that masks will protect them. Some older, high-risk people did not socially distance properly, and some died from COVID-19 because of it. Tragic. Public health officials, scientists must always be honest with the public. In April 2021, I participated in a scientific roundtable hosted by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. This was censored by YouTube. Many nurses were infected while heroically taking care of COVID patients, and some of them were later fired for not taking a vaccine, even though they had stronger immunity than the vaccinated. In October 21, I wrote an article urging hospitals to hire instead of fire nurses with natural immunity, as they are the least likely to infect older, frail patients. This was censored by LinkedIn. The primary victim of censorship is not me and others being censored, but the public. As politicians, to properly serve your constituents, you have both the right to hear from and the duty to listen to a range of scientists. The public also has that right. Censorship inevitably leads to self-censoring. Some of my public health colleagues did not speak up for fear of being censored, silenced, or slandered like I was. When the Bill of Rights was written, Americans had lived through troubled times. They did not use that as an excuse for censorship. I think they understood that freedom of speech is especially important during difficult times when difficult decisions must be made. I hope that the 118th Congress is just as wise as the first Congress was when it adopted the First Amendment as part of the Bill of Rights. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Goldorf, and I now recognize Dr. Miller Idris for her 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivy, members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for your service to our country and for calling attention to the critical issue of disinformation. In addition to being a professor at American University, I also direct a research lab there called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, also known as PERIL. PERIL designs, tests, and scales up evidence-based tools and intervention strategies to help people recognize and reject harmful online content while safeguarding their freedom of speech as an alternative to security-based approaches that rely on surveillance, monitoring, censorship, or banning. We do not teach people what to think. Our work is nonpartisan and rooted in evidence. And our research has demonstrated with consistent statistical significance that people can learn to recognize persuasive and manipulative tactics in order to make more informed choices in their lives, especially online. Over the past 3 years, PERIL has fielded a constant stream of emails and calls from individuals and communities across the country, all asking for help confronting the impacts of disinformation and propaganda in their lives. In Michigan, a grandfather and military veteran wrote to ask what he could do about his grandson who had joined an armed militia. In Texas, faith leaders asked us for ways to support pastors whose congregations were torn apart by partisan polarization and conspiracy theories. In Vermont, a local entrepreneur asked if the school system could help prevent future employees, most of whom he hired from the high school, from espousing propaganda that had become a problem in his staff. These stories illustrate what research evidence has also demonstrated. We face a national crisis rooted in the rampant circulation of disinformation and harmful online content. American communities are coming to us because they feel threatened by online disinformation, and they aren't alone. As the ADL has reported, white supremacist propaganda efforts are at the highest level ever recorded, jumping 38% over 2021 levels, following a pattern of violence that has been escalating for years. The good news is there's a growing body of evidence about what works to equip the public with tools that shore up their own capacity while protecting their right to free speech and reducing the need for security-based approaches. We found that it only takes 7 to 12 minutes of reading one of our intervention guides for its audience to be significantly better informed about harmful online content and the risks of violence, to be more empowered and confident about intervening, to build their own capability to intervene, and to know where to get more help. Importantly, across our work, we found that both prior to and after reading our Parents and Caregivers Guide, Democrats and Republicans did not significantly differ in their knowledge. Republicans scored better, significantly better, 5% better than Democrats did in terms of knowledge of extremism after having read our guide, and members of both political parties reported being satisfied with the guide's contents and equally willing to intervene with a young person. There's also strong emerging evidence that even short interventions can have a lasting impact on local communities. We're currently studying a group of 1,500 parents in 3-month intervals, parents and caregivers, for a full year after reading our intervention tool. 3 months after reading our guide, over 11% said that after the intervention, they either joined or created a group to discuss issues of youth radicalization. 6% of our participants, or about 75 people, told us that within the 3 months after reading our guide, they used what they learned to take direct action to prevent youth from encountering further harmful content. Overall, 3 months after reading our guide, parents and caregivers retained the vast majority of the knowledge and skills they had learned. Taken together, our evidence shows that it's possible to provide communities with tools to be safer online. Parents, grandparents, teachers, coaches, mental health professionals, and others deserve help confronting an unprecedented amount of harmful online content to keep their families safe and protected. We detail several policy recommendations in our written testimony. Most substantially, we would like to see the US government, like some of our allies overseas, create a central, national, nonpartisan center for prevention to help equip local communities with upstream strategies to keep communities safe from online harms. We seek a world in which every community is equipped with the tools they need to reject harmful online propaganda, conspiracy theories, and manipulative content without the need for censorship, surveillance, banning, or security-based solutions. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Miller-Idris, and I now recognize Professor Turley for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivy, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be before you today and also to participate with my esteemed co-witnesses. This is obviously a question of tremendous importance to all of us. We all love our country, and I believe we all love free speech. And we have to find a way to talk to each other, to find a way to deal with our rivaling concerns. From my perspective, I've been an advocate for free speech my entire life. Some people have even called me an absolutist of free speech. There was a time when that was a compliment, but I admit that I do resist most efforts to regulate speech. What we have seen thus far, and we've only seen a fraction of the complex of censorship in the US government, is a censorship system of breathtaking size. We've seen only a fraction through the Twitter files, through some hearings, and some litigation. From the free speech community, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. Every time we deal with a disinformation office that raises concerns, we find out that there are 5 others. And one of the things I'm emphasized in my testimony is that I think people of good faith can come together to at least say that we need to know the full scope of the disinformation system we have in the government. We can debate, and I really took to heart the ranking member's comments about finding solutions here. We can look at those solutions, but we also need to look at what's the current effort thus far in terms of speech regulation, censorship, and blacklisting. Many of these grants, many of these programs are straight blacklisting programs. They are to identify people to discourage, in some cases, advertisers from supporting sites. This is money coming from the US government to support these types of efforts, and that's deeply problematic. Many of these efforts are not just to remove people, but to isolate them. The recent disclosures of LinkedIn as engaging in censorship is an example of that. As an academic, I've seen this. It's an honor to appear with one of our esteemed scientific academics who was the subject of censorship. But the idea is to isolate people, to chill their speech, and it's working. It's succeeding. Now, the whole point of much of my testimony is to look at what the legal standards are, how far the government can go without tripping the wire of the First Amendment, but more importantly, to what extent this damages free speech. And the courts have emphasized over and over again that the government cannot enlist agents to do indirectly what they are prohibited from doing directly. I believe that is what we're seeing today. And the collateral harm is considerable. People talk about speech as harmful. So is censorship. When you censor people like my esteemed colleague from Harvard, you are denying a public debate about public health issues. Issues like, did we need to close our schools? We're facing a terrible psychological and educational crisis that is linked to the shutdowns of the pandemic. We're now debating that when we should have been debating this at the time. Those are costs. Those are costs that come from censorship. Now, in my testimony, I explore the cases that admittedly have a difficult time of when the government trips this wire and under the First Amendment. I'd be happy to talk about that today. I obviously am very critical of CISA's idea that it is supposed to be regulating the cognitive infrastructure. That Orwellian notion really sends people like me into a tight fetal position. The fact is we don't need the government looking at our cognitive anything, whether it's the infrastructure or not. Recently, an English court found someone guilty of toxic ideology. That is a sort of cognitive infrastructure problem. And I hope we don't go in that direction. MDM is designed to give the maximal space for censorship. It is something I hope this committee will turn its back on. Many of us welcome a debate that will come when we know the full extent of these efforts, but let it be an open and honest debate. Let's understand what has been done, and then we can debate as citizens that love this country the type of solutions the ranking member spoke of.
Thank you, Professor Turley. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Weingarten, you laid out in your testimony, your written testimony, that CISA, and that's the reason I think this subcommittee, as the oversight committee, needs to look at this also. It's an issue of supreme importance. That CISA had a central role in creating this, what I refer to as the censorship laundering enterprise. You mentioned they convene meetings, going with social media companies and others and other law enforcement agencies. They switchboarded, meaning that requests to censor would come in from other sources, they'd pass them on. They would brief state officials on sort of what's acceptable thought and not, coordinate with public and private sector partners to, quote, build resilience. And maybe you get a chance to ask Dr. Miller-Idris about that topic. And I wonder if you'd elaborate on this one aspect, this coordination with private sector partners. Professor Turley made reference to it. In the article you made reference to, the Siegel Tablet Mag article, he refers to it as the NGO Borg. That is to say, all these acronymed entities. Talk about that, if you would, a little bit.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, briefly, switchboarding, that concept of receiving purported misinformation or disinformation and then passing it on to a platform and the platform responding and saying escalated and yes, under XYZ policy, we have taken action on this tweet. It seems to me that CISA understood that when it ran up against domestic speech, even though it appears domestic speech was captured in its switchboarding efforts, it recognized that the proper way to do this, in the term that this hearing is used of laundering it, could be better done through outsourcing those efforts, but in close coordination with the government. And so you mentioned before EIP, the Election Integrity Partnership. This is a consortium of 4 outside non-governmental groups. It includes the Stanford Internet Observatory, University of Washington's CIP, the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, as well as a company called Graphica. Many of these organizations have links and ties to government officials. And essentially what CISA did in conjunction with EIP, and according to EIP officials, with some interns who were both working at CISA while at the same time members of SIO, the Stanford Internet Observatory, was create a platform to pass along purported dis, and malinformation, for this platform to, as shown in that graphic before, collect and surveil tweets, to then, for this platform to pressure social media companies to change their terms of service, and then flag for them specific instances of content they believed ran up against those flags. And consequently, it led to, as shown, 22 million tweets and retweets and such to be labeled misinformation.
That phenomenon appears to be, it sort of goes underground, the government censoring effort, and there are a lot of other indications that it's kind of the cracks are being covered. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that some more. Dr. Koldorf, you're an epidemiologist of 30 years experience, 2 decades at Harvard. You are, to me, the epitome of a public health expert. And you made some views, expressed some views on COVID issues, and then you were censored. And CISA may have played a role in that. CISA, one of the connections is this election integrity project, or whatever it's called, partnership, became the Virality Project, which then censored COVID information. So not only were you censored by YouTube and Twitter and the like, there was a government hand in this kind of censorship. Thank you for your role in the Attorney Generals of Louisiana and Missouri's litigation. That is, frankly, to be thanked for the exposure of a lot of it. How does that make you feel that the government was responsible for censoring your views?
I think it's stunning. And if you had mentioned this 3 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you that scientists would be censored in this country.
Dr. Miller-Idris, you have said one thing I appreciated in your testimony. You said that we should protect people's First Amendment rights as you go about that. How do you propose to do that?
Sorry. Thank you for the question. I would say by not telling them what to think, by not censoring them, by not telling people what they should be thinking, but just helping them make better choices about recognizing some of the tricky content that, for example, their kids encounter online.
Well, but there's a recognition. The Supreme Court's recognized that there's a First Amendment right of access to information as well as the right to speak.
Yeah.
If one of your proposals in your policy recommendation list is that you continue to work with the tech sector to remove harmful and dangerous content. If it's content that the First Amendment allows, how could you possibly justify removing it as a government agency?
Well, I would say as a government employee or agency or anyone would want to remove criminal content that is incitement to violence, criminal content, something that is inciting someone, that is live streaming the murder of people in a Walmart, for example. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about harmful content.
And my 5 minutes have expired, unfortunately. I hope we'll have a second round. I now recognize Ranking Member Ivey for 5 minutes for questions he may have.
I'm pretty sure we'll have a second round, whether we like it or not. Professor Turley, let me come back to you, and I thought I'd pulled up your testimony here, but it goes to the question I raised when I was making my opening statement, which was that you'd raised the issue. Oh, I'm sorry, it's page 18 of your testimony. Disinformation does cause divisions, but the solution is not to embrace government-sponsored, government corporate censorship, I'm sorry. So what would be the types of solutions we're looking at? And I'll just off Dr. Miller-Idris's statement, for example, a new phenomenon apparently is people, I guess when I was a kid, they would pull the fire alarm. Now they're making calls and saying that there's an active shooter at elementary school X. And because of the networking that everything has now, that gets picked up by the police and EMT and frightened parents, news media, even though it's false. So one example, I mean, there's multiple others. We could talk about the recruitment videos and the like, and you might have gradations of those, but I mean, what would be your take on how we should be addressing these kinds of issues?
Thank you very much for that question. I actually think there is a lot of common ground there in terms of what we can do positively to deal with disinformation. Disinformation is a real thing. It is a thing that people go on the internet. It seems to be a license for people, and in an age of rage, that license can be truly horrific when you look at how people transform themselves on the internet. What I would stress is that the government should not be in the business of censorship. That's a bright line that the government can live with. Instead, it should focus on producing better information and to have offices that can counter. Because remember, the courts have accepted that, the Supreme Court has said the government doesn't have to be neutral on information. When it speaks, it's allowed to take a side. It's allowed to say what it believes is true.
Well, but let's follow up on that. So I, as government official, learned that there's no active shooter at that elementary school. And I've, call YouTube, Twitter, whoever, and say, hey, look, that's false information. You're scaring parents to death. Can you take that down?
Well, first of all, that example you gave may indeed be a crime under state law to make false claims of that kind with the purpose of triggering panic. But more importantly, one of the things that can be done is that the social media companies and the government can immediately flag information they believe is untrue and speak in their own voice. What I think we need to develop, and I think there's a lot of room there to develop it, is to try to create better guardrails that keeps the U.S. government on this side of censorship, and that includes the use of agencies, the use of private companies, in my view, do trigger the First Amendment. I think that the government has actually violated First Amendment.
Since I'm running out of time, there was something else I wanted to raise. I'll have to come back to you all in the next round. You did mention Nina Jankowicz in your statement, who I had a chance to meet during a deposition in the Judiciary Committee, and I've started following her and what happened with respect to her. She was the person, as you may recall, who was appointed to head that board. And as it turned out, she was essentially forced out of the position before it was even formed. And I'll offer a couple of articles here that can be put into the record, but there's an individual named Jack Posobiec, I guess his name is, who put out arguably false information about her that got picked up by Chairman Jordan and others. Actually, I think Ms. Taylor Greene had some comments with respect to it. We can put them in the record. I think Mr. Gates did as well. That sort of escalated into her getting death threats. She had to hire a security company. She was 8 months pregnant.
Parliamentary question, Mr. Chairman.
I didn't say that she...
He mentioned my name and accused me of saying false information about Nina Jankowicz.
Committee will be, the committee will be at ease.
Can we pause the clock?
Yeah, please do. In fact, put 20 seconds back on the clock, please.
Yeah.
Committee will suspend. Members are reminded not to engage in personalities, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. But members of Congress made comments about her that took on a life of their own. They became viral on the internet, led to the death threats that she got, and still gets, actually, even though she's been out of the position for about a year at least. And I think she's filing a lawsuit against Fox for propagating these stories as well. But you know, she was clearly a victim of, in my view, misinformation, disinformation. You know, and from her perspective, it was very ironic because that's what she was actually brought into the government to try and address. So I'll come back to it later, but thank you, Professor Turley, for your comments.
The gentleman yields back,
you,
and
sir.
I now recognize the gentlelady, Ms. Green of Georgia, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for coming before our committee today. I am one of those that believe our First Amendment is one of the greatest rights that we have. And I also am so grateful to be an American, always believing that freedom of speech was something that we possessed until the past few years, where myself and many other Americans, Dr. Kuldorf, we found ourselves, I like you, had my Twitter account permanently banned for posting my speech, opinions, and thoughts on Twitter about COVID-19. I'm not a doctor or an expert like you are. You certainly are an expert in the field, and it was a shame that you had your speech censored. But it's appalling to me that CISA, which is taxpayer funded by the American people, the same American people that are given the right to the freedom of speech, that are given this great freedom by our founders, had their speech censored. And that combination between the Homeland Security and CISA working with private companies, big tech companies and others to silence Americans is a grave assault on all of these Americans' First Amendment rights. So I'd like to ask each of you, Mr. Weingarten, do you believe in the First Amendment?
Wholeheartedly.
Since we're talking about truth and information, given that CISA engaged in this, and this with the Department of Homeland, who is the author of truth? And I'll ask each of you again, who's in charge of truth? Mr. Weingarten.
Well, I believe as citizens, we're all entitled to evaluate facts and opinions and decide for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kuldorf?
Nobody's in charge. It's a collective responsibility.
Dr. Miller, address.
I agree. There's no truth with a capital T. I think we all need to be equipped with the tools to evaluate evidence and make decisions.
Mr. Turley?
I agree with all those comments.
Great. This is very overwhelmingly fantastic. But I'd like to ask a question, Dr. Miller, address if I may. You're an expert on so-called right-wing extremism, including online radicalization by right-wing extremist groups. You've written several books on right-wing extremism, including Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. You're a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, Tracking Hate and Extremism Advisory Committee. I couldn't find any of your work studying left extremism or Antifa or BLM. I mean, we all know Antifa and BLM riots are responsible for $2 billion on damage across American cities in 2020. And Antifa literally took over Portland and declared their own autonomous zone. So I'm just wondering, how do you consider your organization, Peril, and a good source of informing people on what they should believe and not believe when you do no study whatsoever into left extremism?
Thank you for the question. I'm an expert on the far right because I spent the first 20 years of my career working in Germany in the post-Holocaust, post-unification surge of far right extremism. And I know you have a hearing on Tuesday on far left extremism.
Yeah, but Dr. Miller, just to let you know, this is America. We're not Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I absolutely right. But that's how, when I pivoted here, the first time I was asked to testify was about that evidence that I had learned from what Germany had been doing, and then that became relevant here for policymakers. But we don't, first of all, just to respond to your query about what we teach people, we don't teach people anything. We are just looking at helping them understand what the tactics of manipulation are online so they can make better decisions. We have experts who do work on environmental extremism. We have experts who work on Islamist forms of extremism. But because both under the Trump administration and the Biden administration, the emphasis has been right now on the greatest, most lethal threat, which has been determined to be far right, meaning white supremacist extremism and unlawful militias.
Well, Dr. Miller, just real quick, I'm out of time, but would you consider Trump supporters extremists?
We are worried about violent extremism, so that to the extent, not about what people believe, but to the extent that they are moving toward violence.
Trump supporters specifically.
If they're calling for violence, it doesn't matter to me who they support.
Haven't seen any. By the way, there's a great rally in Iowa this weekend. If you want to study people on the right and what they believe, you'll find secure borders, freedom of speech.
Gentlewoman's time.
No crime. Thank you.
Gentlewoman's
I
time
yield
has
back.
expired. I recognize Mrs. Ramirez for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Ivey. I have a couple of comments for Dr. Miller Idris, but I want to come back real quick before that to something I heard a couple of my colleagues mention. And this question is for Dr. Koldorf. I heard that it was referred that you too have been censored by CISA, and sharing that concern that both of you are censored. Could you give me examples of how CISA has censored you?
I was censored by Twitter, by YouTube, by LinkedIn, Facebook, and Reddit. They don't tell who is behind it. So sometimes they don't say anything. Whatever I say sort of just disappears. Sometimes one gets a note saying something of the style of it goes against our standards, but they never tell. They never told me, the person being censored, who was behind it.
So, Doctor, just for record here, I think on record here, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, you have no evidence that they censored you. You were told by Twitter and other social media outlets that you were not allowed to continue posting these things, but CISA itself, there's no evidence, was censoring you, correct?
They
yes
never
or no?
They never disclosed who sort of was behind it or what was behind it.
Okay. Well, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that that was on the record, that CISA itself had not censored you. There's no evidence of that. So I want to come back, Dr. Miller Idris, to the work that you've been doing, your work on disinformation and the role of hate and community violence. Look, it could not be happening at a more urgent time. We talk about the border here, we talk about children, families, people seeking asylum, and there's all sorts of things that are said about them. And just a few days ago, someone senselessly drove their car into a group of migrants outside of a shelter in Brownsville, the same border that my mother crossed pregnant of me. A witness of the horrible scene heard the attacker make anti-immigrant remarks after he initially tried to run away after pulling his car into people, killing several and injuring more. There isn't always a written manifesto to directly point to when it comes to extreme hate, but we know there's a troubling connection between spreading hateful ideas and extreme violence that destabilizes entire communities. And the cost for this could be human lives. In your testimony, you shared that pace, scope, and scale of violent extremism have probably increased and are escalating rapidly due to propaganda, conspiracy theories, and disinformation. Is that correct?
Yes.
What kind of impact does spreading propaganda and disinformation have on vulnerable communities, such as immigrants and asylum seekers?
The impact on vulnerable communities, of course, is to terrorize them, right? So we saw that in Buffalo, we've seen that in Pittsburgh, we've seen that in record-breaking anti-Semitism and attacks on the LGBTQ community. With every vulnerable community, essentially, we're seeing spikes, surges, or record-breaking hate. Hate crimes are higher than they've been in well over a decade. So the impact is on families that are torn apart, communities that are torn apart, but also people who are afraid to go to synagogue, to go to church, to go to their school board meetings, in some cases, that they're going to be met with violent protesters.
Thank you. And there's this extremely disturbing rise in people who commit extreme violence that cite the Great Replacement theory, which, to be absolutely clear, is a white supremacist conspiracy theory that alleges that white people are being replaced by Black and brown people, including immigrants. In your opinion, what are the most effective strategies for countering conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory that promote deadly violence and are frequently a source of inspiration for people who commit horrific violence in our communities?
Well, what we have found is that nobody likes to find out that they're being manipulated. People do not like to find out that they're being manipulated or that they're at risk of manipulation. I think it's extremely difficult to counter propaganda and conspiracy theories. Once they circulate, you get into challenges to freedom of speech, you get into censorship issues, and you also get into ineffective strategies, as we've seen. But what does work is to prevent people from believing it in the first place. We have excellent evidence that that can be done by teaching them how manipulative tactics work and letting them make up their own minds.
Dr. Miller-Idris, I really appreciate all of your work. And Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Ezell for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. CISA has an important mission in safeguarding cyber networks and protecting the physical infrastructure that our society depends on. The agency has enjoyed a broad bipartisan support since Congress established CISA in 2018 because it plays a key role in protecting the homeland. It is my goal that this continues with its original intent. Mr. Weingarten, what concerns do you have about CISA's ability to fulfill its core responsibilities?
Well, I would say there's a huge opportunity cost to devoting resources supposed to be intended towards foreign threat actors, towards domestic ones, and on the basis of interpreting speech to be a threat to a virtually limitlessly defined critical infrastructure up to including our brains. So the first thing would be it's a huge shift in resources, and to the extent it's trampling on our rights directly or by proxy, that directly undermines its mission.
Thank you. Documents obtained in a lawsuit show Brian Scully, a deputy of CISA's Countering Foreign Influence Task Force, communicating regularly with external organizations. At one point, Mr. Scully even offers up a CISA-run webpage as a resource to help with one partner's pre-bunking efforts. In other words, CISA was generating content and then pushing it to external parties to shape their censorship efforts. Can you walk us through some of the key players involved in discussions like these and how they work together to create a censorship operation? Mr. Weingarten.
So as you noted, Mr. Scully is one senior official who I believe is the chief of the MDM team now, and it's worth noting that foreign task force became the MDM team, going from foreign to domestic and foreign actors under its purview. Beyond that, Matt Masterson, I believe, was a top election official within CISA. He ultimately would end up, I believe, becoming maybe a non-resident fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory. There's sort of a revolving door here. Worth noting, Christopher Krebs as well, former director of CISA. He ended up starting a consultancy with the head of SIO, Alex Stamos. And we can go through several other individuals on the outside as well. So non-CISA officials, but officials, or rather principals, who were coordinated by CISA, worked with CISA, ended up on CISA's advisory committees and such. Those would include Kate Starbird at the University of Washington's CIP as well. Renee DiResta within SIO, I believe was a research director there. She had direct ties to CISA advisory committees as well. So there's a slew of people, and it's sort of a revolving door, and it starts to blur the line between public and private.
Thank you. Professor Turley, this censorship laundering enterprise basically gives government officials and their private sector partners the power to control public discourse. What is the danger of the government focusing on some of these subjective terms like misinformation and malinformation?
Well, the danger is significant. You have terms like malinformation. It starts out by saying the information may be true, but we're going to target that information because it's being used to manipulate others. Statements like that are really quite chilling for all of us that value free speech. And the question is, should the government be in that business? But it is in that business. I mean, in terms of the two legal issues that we look at, these are government agents who are acting. So we don't even have to get into the question of whether there's an agency relationship with private companies. There are government officials who are taking these acts and actively participating in what is the largest censorship system in the history of this country. And then second, you have private actors who are being used by what I call censorship by surrogate. Both of those raise constitutional questions. But putting all that aside, one of the things I emphasize in my testimony is people constantly have this mantra, it's not a First Amendment problem, so it's not a free speech problem. That's not true. The First Amendment is designed to deal with one problem of free speech. It was the traditional, the most looming problem at the time. It is not synonymous or exclusive with the term free speech. What the US government is doing now is a serious threat to free speech.
Thank you, Mr. Turley. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Ms. Clark for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank our panel of witnesses for joining us today and thank Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey for calling this hearing. The department's role in addressing mis, dis, and malinformation is certainly a worthy topic of discussion for this subcommittee. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues are politicizing a serious issue today, and I'd like to set the record straight. The rapid spread of mis, dis, and malinformation is a threat to our security and to the institutions at the foundation of our democracy. Both the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General and the Homeland Security Advisory Council have determined disinformation to be a threat to national security and to the successful execution of DHS's mission from disaster response to border security to election security. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record reports on disinformation from the DHS Office of the Inspector General and the Homeland Security Advisory Council.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. As the former chair of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, I'm acutely aware of the threat mis, dis, and malinformation poses to the election security and other critical infrastructure. In 2020, DHS had to provide guidance to telecommunications firms to prevent attacks on 5G cell towers linked to a COVID conspiracy theory. In the wake of the election, related disinformation campaigns aimed to undermine public confidence in election outcomes. CISA established rumor control to serve as a trusted source of election information. Suffice it to say, the threat posed by disinformation is real, and we have to take it seriously. Dr. Miller-Idris, I thank you for your testimony today and for your leadership in developing mechanisms to combat disinformation. Would it surprise you to learn that the intelligence community had referenced misinformation or disinformation as a threat to national security in every worldwide threat assessment except one since 2016?
No, that does not surprise me.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the worldwide threat assessments from 2016, 2018, and 2023.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. I'm concerned that my colleagues are attempting to make a real discussion about combating disinformation so politically toxic that no one will touch it. And what kind of threat does that pose to our national security? Well, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Strong for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to remember those that are defending America's southern border as we're a matter of hours from not an insurgent, but an all-out invasion of tens of thousands of illegal migrants, to name a few, from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Cuba, Haiti, Iran, Russia, and China too. While fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, marijuana continues to pour into America, and the Secretary of Homeland Security continues to testify and spew that on every network he has operational control of the southern border. As this administration struggles to admit that their policies created the southern border debacle that will soon unfold before the world's eyes, the fact is President Donald Trump's policies worked and America was protected. Thank you again for being here with us today. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, was originally formed under the Trump administration to reduce and eliminate threats to U.S. critical physical and cyber infrastructure. It's hard to believe the agency has gotten so far away from its original mission. This shouldn't come as a surprise if you recall CISA Director Jen Easterly's view on CISA's mission, which Chairman Bishop just reminded us of. In August of 2021, she said, one could argue we're in the business of critical infrastructure, and the most critical infrastructure is our cognitive infrastructure. The director of CISA, whose mission is to protect and secure our country's sensitive infrastructure, is more worried about policing America's thoughts than cyber attacks coming from China and Russia. Much of the public information regarding CISA's censorship activities is only known because of the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit and the release of internal communications from Twitter after it came under new ownership. One such revelation includes that there is a formalized process for government officials to directly flag content on Facebook and Instagram and request its removal or suppression. I have an image that I would like to put on the screen.
So ordered.
This is the landing page for Meta's content request system, which is still active as of this morning. You must have a government or law enforcement email to use. Yet CISA officials maintain that they, and I quote, don't flag anything to social media organizations at all. We don't do any censorship. Mr. Weingarten, can you share some additional examples of actions that DHS and CISA specifically have taken to keep their actions hidden from America's people?
Thank you, Congressman.
Yes, sir.
Several instances of this. First, there's been stonewalling of congressional inquiries into CISA's efforts, and subsequently the House Judiciary Weaponization Subcommittee has subpoenaed Director Easterly in connection with the subject that we're talking about today. Beyond that, there's been scrubbing of not only documents, but also websites, which illustrate the fact that CISA was intently focused and may well still be intently focused, and certainly its partners are intently focused on domestic speech. In fact, it's almost comical. If you go to a site, I believe the URL was cisa.gov/MDM, it now takes you to a foreign dis and malinformation site. There's no sign of domestic activity that it's pursuing related to it. So I'd say scrubbing, stonewalling are the two biggest instances that we've seen thus far.
Thank you. There have been several examples of DHS trying to expand its censorship activities only to back down when the public found out, such as last year's effort to create a disinformation governance board. Mr. Weingarten, do these actions suggest about where DHS would like to go in the disinformation space in the future?
I think by the words of the DHS Secretary, Absolutely. But if they are not able to carry it on, their partners, actually in the private sector side, were encouraging the creation, I believe, of something like a Center for Mis- and Disinformation Excellence within the government, and that seems to be what the DGB was intended to be. But we have many other ministries of countering mis, dis, and malinformation, even if there isn't some oversight body layered onto it.
Thank you. I thank each of you for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for being here. I'd like to take a second to push back on one of my colleagues' comments that he made a second ago to a friend of mine who's not in the room to defend herself. Mr. Ivey actually said, quote, "I guess Ms. Lake is still saying that the election was stolen from her, even though there's clear, according to the officials in the state, that this was not the case." Now, I find it funny when people in this town use that defense, according to the officials. Right. Like the American people believe the officials. They don't. A recent Pew study showed that only 20% of the American people believe the elected officials. You know, and it's also funny too, because we all know that election fraud couldn't take place in this country, could it? Right? This is America. That couldn't take place here.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Just recently, we're finding out that this president, this commander-in-chief, has used his position and influence for years to funnel millions of dollars to his family. That's something I also thought I'd never see in this town.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
No, I will not. No, I will not.
I mean, you did invoke my name.
Well, I actually quoted you, so I will not. All right. Though I don't agree with Mr. Ivey's comments, I'm glad that he's allowed to say them, because I do support the First Amendment. I support his First Amendment. I support everybody in this room's First Amendment. And you know what? You know what's important about supporting the First Amendment? It's most important when you disagree with people. That's really the only time it's important, because when we don't agree, everybody supports the First Amendment when you agree with somebody. And it's interesting because I was listening to the panel up here, and we went down the line, and everybody here said that they support the First Amendment. Yet, when we were going back and researching some of Dr. Miller Idris's comments, MSNBC 7/17 of 2022, on the January 6 hearings, she says this: "What we need right now is a massive investment in and commitment to countering disinformation at all levels. This includes holding tech companies accountable for dangerous and harmful information shared on their platforms." She goes on to say, "It requires strategies to prevent public and elected officials from sharing disinformation or trying to undermine our elections and the peaceful transfer of power. But above all, we need serious and sustained public education and campaigns to build population-wide resilience to disinformation, understanding of source integrity, and ways to distill false claims from true facts." It's interesting, ma'am, because it seems like you only support free speech when you agree with it, or you wouldn't make the statement, "It requires strategies." I'm going to zone in here on this: strategies to prevent public and elected officials from sharing disinformation. I've gone through some of your tweets, ma'am. Whether we're talking about COVID vaccines or, far-right extreme groups, there's a lot of things that you and I would disagree on. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of things that people sitting on your left and right would disagree on. But you think that we should stop them from being able, according to your own quote, according to your own words, that we should stop them from being able to say that. And that's a problem, man, because I'll tell you again, the most important time to support somebody's free speech isn't when you agree with them. It's when you disagree with them. And ma'am, I hope that you and others that think like you are not successful, because I fought really hard to make sure that my kids and hopefully someday my grandkids don't live under communism or socialism or some other tyrannical dictatorship. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Tanadar is recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll get it.
I want to thank all the witnesses to be here and for your testimony. I have a question for Dr. Miller Idris, if I may. as we have heard here today, the disinformation that spreads online can have dangerous real-world consequences. Disinformation has been used to incite violence, including the January 6th insurrection, and crime targeted at ethnic minorities. This disinformation drown out marginalized voices. Dr. Miller Idris, based on your research and expertise, what have you found are the best strategies for combating pervasive disinformation campaigns?
Thank you for the question. What we find in the evidence is that the best way to work to combat disinformation, if you will, is to prevent people from making the choices that would lead to the spread of that to begin with. So we focus on teaching people about manipulative tactics, regardless of the content, and also about recognizing sort of warning signs in their loved ones, regardless of the ideology. So for example, one of the things we hear from our focus groups is that young people have been saying in classrooms things like, there is no political solution, right? That comes from the left, that comes from the right. And it is a call to violence to say there's no more political solution, we have to move to violence. And so if an adult hears that, they know that a child is exposed to something online that is potentially opening up rabbit holes of further harm and disinformation. So that's what we work on.
Thank you. Now, despite my Republican colleagues' misplaced fixation on the defunct Disinformation Governance Board and their own disinformation on the board's intended role, the Department of Homeland Security has a significant and valid role to play in combating the dangerous disinformation that compromises our security. There are plenty of examples of disinformation occurring that has a Homeland Security nexus, including that tied to domestic terrorism, election security, migration, and disaster responses. Now, to what extent should DHS and other governmental agencies be identifying and addressing harmful content that may threaten Homeland Security?
Thank you for the question. I think that what we hear, anyway, in our lab is that American communities are desperate. They are worried. They're worried about what they're seeing, what their loved ones are seeing, and they're afraid. And so I think that the government has an obligation to help local communities with better ways to recognize and reject harmful content. And I think that that includes a national security frame, but not exclusively a national security frame. That has to also be something that is education, that is health and human services, that is about what local communities need. And that needs to include some expertise in where to draw the line. And I would welcome the opportunity to have longer conversations about where that line falls, because I think that's one of the biggest issues we face.
Well, I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and we'll proceed to a second round of questioning. We are up against votes, so we'll try to proceed as quickly as we can, and we'll see with the witnesses are available to remain. If we have to have a break for votes, we'll see if you can do that. But so I've at this time, well, let me do this first. I want to, without objection, I want to submit for the record the graphic shown by Mr. Strong during his 5 minutes, the Facebook content request screen. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. So, Dr. Miller Idris, I want to sort of pursue where I left off and others have illustrated. I think you said, notwithstanding what you wrote, that we should continue to work with social media platforms to remove harmful and dangerous, I think was your terminology. And then you gave some examples, for example, a bomb threat or something like that. That's illegal speech, not protected by the First Amendment. But let me just clarify, because I think the concern is whether or not you're concerned about manipulation and propaganda and these sort of things, or maybe a subterfuge for subtle censorship. So let me get at it in this way. Do you believe that propaganda from foreign governments should be allowed on social media, and the federal government should, or the government should take no effort to interfere with or facilitate its removal?
I believe that if there is disinformation circulating from foreign governments that is intended to harm our democracy, that should be removed, that should be removed.
Are you a lawyer?
No.
Well, okay, so there's a case called Lamont versus Postmaster General from 1965. It's old law in which the United States Supreme Court held that a United States citizen has a First Amendment right to foreign communist propaganda to come through the mails to us. Do you think communist propaganda might be harmful?
I think that I think I'm flattered that you think that my expertise extends that broadly to disinformation and propaganda across the spectrum. My expertise as a professor of education is about equipping communities with tools to reject harmful content.
Well, and I'm not trying to be unfair. What I am trying to pin you down a little bit, because there's this notion, and I think Professor Turley's gotten to it some, but there's this notion out there that, well, we're not against, we want to preserve, I get this all the time. We're going to protect the First Amendment, protect everybody's First Amendment rights. But what I just was sharing with you is that there's a First Amendment right to propaganda, communist propaganda from abroad that's been established as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
And so is that harmful? Is that within, do you include that? And I'm not trying to repeat the question. I am trying to say this. If you're trying to, you say you want to teach people what is manipulative and not to be manipulated, I have no problem about that. But you also are proposing to this committee that there's a massive government investment. Government should invest in you, frankly. Well, let me ask you this. You are funded by the Department of Homeland Security, right? Is anybody else here, by the way, funded by the Department of Homeland Security? You have funding from the National Science Foundation, is that correct?
I did.
You did? Okay. Anybody else? The government, I think what concerns me is you seem to think that you are the right arbiter to decide what is misinformation, malinformation, which is actually true, but somehow being misused for harm. Yeah. How do you arrogate that? I mean, I don't know if it's the wrong term. How do you assume that you should be the arbiter? With respect, you are on the left. There's a tweet from a couple days ago where you're talking about whiteness and how the Irish were not white and then became white. I mean, it seems to me to be fairly extreme, even by the standards I hear from my colleagues in the Democrat. Why should you be the arbiter to decide who needs to be protected from manipulation or propaganda?
I understand the question and your concern, and I should not be the arbiter as an individual. I run a research lab, and when we get asked to equip local communities with tools, we do a comprehensive mapping of all propaganda. We do interviews, focus groups with people. We figure out what that content is, and then we create the tools, and then we test it like we did, like I reported on here today. So I'm never putting my opinion into, I'm a columnist separately with an opinion, but I never put my opinion into the classroom or into the research tools that comes from a group of people who are hired to work on with their methodological expertise.
Let me see if I can get the professor in, Professor Turley, to deal with this, because it seems to me that, the notion that the government should take, with all respect, Dr. Miller Idris's view of what is manipulative or what is misinformation, and then have that sort of spread out to the public to teach them to be prepared is a recipe for disaster. Can you speak to that, Mr.
Well,
Professor
it's also tragically familiar. I'm just finishing a book on free speech now, and it goes back to England before the Revolution. And many of the rationales we use today actually came from not only England, but came from the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber was used to prosecute sedition, and they came up with this idea that there's, quote, bad tendency speech, that there's some speech that has a bad tendency. And that took hold in the United States. Even though many of the framers rejected it, it took hold with some early decisions. Holmes is a good example of losing his mind by talking about crying fire in a crowded theater, which he regretted. And that decision was later rejected by the Supreme Court. The government should not be in the disinformation business. It should not be trying to shape speech. It's a very clear line, and one that we have lost.
And one of the problems, and I'll turn it over in just a second, but one of the problems seems to me that people think it's a vague concept. They want to preserve the full right to speak, that the First Amendment, or the right to have access to information. And yet, I'm not sure we know what that is. You've got to know what the law is before you know whether you're agreeing with it or you're doing something in violation of it, with all respect. So my time is more than expired. I yield to Mr. Ivey for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a complicated area. I mean, just sort of what we're going through. For example, the statement that there's no specific truth, which I think sounds fine in the abstract, but if you say something like, sir, if someone accused you of being a sexual pedophile, how would you respond? That's a false statement. That's definitely not true. And so when we say there's no such thing as truth, I do kind of struggle with those. With the issue with respect to elections, Mr. Crane's gone. We had a chance to chat a little bit outside, but just briefly, and I'll come back to this point, I did want to note that he mentioned public officials aren't trusted, but only public official can certify elections. So, if there's no public official in Arizona that's going to say the election is accepted, it's usually the Secretary of State. I don't know what they do out there with that, but I'm pretty sure they do it just like all the other 50 states do. But anyway, back to this point. I think really quick on that point, we talked about government speech and what they do. Wear your seatbelts. I'm old enough to remember a time before we had seatbelts, and then there was a pushback about putting them in the cars, and then there was pushback and free speech pushback, but statements I think were clearly false, that they weren't necessary, they didn't save lives. I'm okay with the government doing that. Tobacco's another one. I grew up in North Carolina and Virginia. Everything, they almost had tobacco-flavored pacifiers in North Carolina back in those days because it was the way to go, but clearly it was dangerous to our health. I don't even know if the tobacco industry has come around to acknowledging that, but clearly it's true. It hurts your health, and clearly when their denials were false. Another one's drunk driving. I remember when, people have a steering wheel in one hand and, a beer in the other one, and it was okay. That had to change over time because it was true that driving and drinking were a bad combination. So I think it can be tricky if we, get too absolute in the statements that we're making along these lines. And I do take Professor Turley's point, although even in those circumstances, I think there's scenarios where it makes sense for the government to at least be involved. Now, we might not say they should be able to take down information, but in the damaging scenarios that we talked about, for example, or people giving false weather information, just things that can really cause dislocations in people's lives. I think it should be an option for the government to say, no, that's incorrect. We run into scenarios with respect to COVID and others. I take that point, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think we have to be careful about sort of pushing and saying none of them can get involved. And I apologize. We were just talking about we wish we had more than 5 minutes. I mean, sort of the question I had, Mr. Weingarten, you raised, well, and Mr. Turley too, I guess, sort of the private entities coming together to have communications about what to take down or whatever. And I take it you view that as, you see negative connotations around that. I do kind of wonder if there's some good reasons for them to do that. For example, lawsuits in the government are now pushing them in the direction of they're being pushed towards managing content. And if they don't, they get in trouble for it. Matter of fact, they get dragged up here by Congress, who beats them up about not taking it down. We could go back to the TikTok hearing, what was that, last month? I don't agree with everything TikTok's doing, but we are putting a lot on them and expecting them to manage content and essentially publicly punishing them when they don't. So there may be a reason they're having those conversations. Maybe we'll have another hearing where people can come up and from DHS and from some of these entities. I'm open to that. We could talk about it then. I did want to finish with this. Nina Jankowicz, I did want to not leave that unfinished. There's a couple articles I'd like to offer for the record. One is A Surreal Experience, former Biden disinfo chief details harassment. That's out of Politico. And then the other one is Old Comments by Disinformation Board Director Misrepresented Online. That's an AP story. I'd like to offer those for the record as well.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman yields back, and the gentlelady, Ms. Clark, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I had stated in my conversation with the panel just a few minutes ago, that I am concerned that my colleagues are attempting to make any discussion about combating disinformation so politically toxic that no one will touch it. And, that's a threat. It's a threat to our way of life. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. Miller Idris, what type of threat does it pose to our national security? Because this is the Homeland Security Committee. A lot of the conversation we've had here today really should be in the Judiciary Committee, but let's speak specifically about national security.
Well, the kinds of propaganda and disinformation that we work on, like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, the false Great Replacement conspiracy theory, motivate terrorist actors. Even when there's not a specific conspiracy theory like that or a specific manifesto, we see that these toxic online cultures motivate shootings like in Highland Park or Uvalde or in Texas this past weekend. So, I think a lot of what we're seeing here is that we have a lot of agreement. Nobody wants censorship, actually, I think. None of us want censorship at all. I think if you're not going to have censorship and banning, then there has to be something at the other end to equip people to recognize and reject. What happens in the middle is how do you determine what actually that disinformation is? And I think there's some very clear cases, like I think most people, I hope, would agree that the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is extremely harmful disinformation that has caused terrorist shootings, that leads to terrorist acts. And I hope that we can get some help from the government for the communities that keep coming to us desperate for help, because I really feel bad for them, and we're trying to equip them with better tools.
Thank you. And I find myself sort of trying to figure out when I hear, my colleagues talk about the fact that there's a right to free speech, 100% full stop. And then I hear about all the states that are banning books right now. There just seems to be such a major contradiction. It just blows my mind. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Let's see, I guess we have votes on the floor, so we certainly won't proceed to a final or further round. I do thank the witnesses for the valuable testimony. It is interesting to me as I hear all of this, it's something that begs digging into further. I think we miss each other in terminology going back and forth, even to the point just made by Dr. Miller Idris. If someone advocates what did you call it? A great replacement theory. You look at U.S. v. Brandenburg. It's clearly protected First Amendment speech. And then the question, I respect Ms. Clark's inquiry she's repeated, and Mr. Ivey's, that there's a question of how to combat disinformation, but there's certainly things you can't do, and the government can't prohibit that which the Supreme Court has said for a long time is clearly protected. So it's a confounding area, but one that requires, and I agree with I appreciate the ranking member's comment that it's something that warrants further examination. And I hope we'll have a chance to do that further in another continuation hearing. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
A Russian man claiming to hold top-level secrets about Russian advanced bombers has just turned up at the U.S. southern border, seeking asylum. The man claims to have been an engineer at a production facility over in the city of Kazan, and he says that he possesses top-secret information about the White Swan Tu-160, which is the most advanced bomber in the Russian arsenal. U.S. border officials, they interviewed the man, and they determined that his story was in fact credible and eventually passed him off to the FBI, who are still in the process of interrogating him right now. However, analysts have pointed out that the fact that the story was even leaked to the public is an indication that perhaps the American government is encouraging other Russians who also hold top-level secrets to also escape to America. And if you thought that was interesting, well then you should click on that button below this video and check out Epoch TV, one of the best no censorship video platforms on the internet.